Thank you, Katie. This is a panel on controversial images in Texas art, and we have three distinguished panelists here to discuss that question and to answer your questions. So if you have any questions, please hold them until we get through with this introduction, and we will look at your questions. I put together a few slides just to try to set the scene for the discussion. You probably recognize the sculpture of Robert E. Lee that was at Lee Park in Dallas. But starting in 1836, this is an image of how Davy died, and considering what we know about the way he died today, I guess you might consider it a controversial or at least an incorrect image. Texas was controversial from the very beginning, though. This is the election of 1844, in which James K. Polk and Dallas won the election. This is Martin Van Buren. Andrew Jackson is prodding him to face Dame Texas. And he says, take any other shape but that. Dame Texas was too difficult for him to confront in that election. And of course, he was defeated because he really didn't take a stand. This is another image coming from about the same time, 1845 or 1846, young Texas in repose. At a glance, you think this is a bale of cotton, but you very quickly realize that it's a slave who is handcuffed. Not a very pretty image at all. Then here is Sam Houston recruiting in 1855. You remember in the 1850s, Sam had a dalliance with the Know Nothing Party, and this is a German artist in San Antonio, Wilhelm Telepapi, and he is picturing Sam Houston here, and there's some pretty dire things that he has to say about Sam. He's treading on the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. This is his heart. He's wearing the face of Washington to confuse people. This, of course, is what he's really touting. And you see the bottles, the brandy, the wine. So his picture of Sam Houston is not very attractive. This is Texas Ranger in 1861. It's often considered to be humorous, and indeed it is, but when you look at the date, July the 6th, 1861, you realize that the Civil War has already started. Fort Sumter was bombarded in April of 1861. Probably about 1867 after the Civil War. Here's another version of young Texas. This is for Reconstruction, so obviously they don't like Reconstruction. And this is called, Do You Want to Bet? I was going to make a reference to one of your comments, Eleanor, but I'll pass that one by. But young Texas is not a very intelligent looking figure. But we began to reflect on the Texas Revolution with the Dawn at the Alamo painting that's in the Senate chamber in the state capitol. Is that a controversial picture? Well, look closely. Sometimes it can be kind of controversial, perhaps. This is a picture you may know, Kindred McCleary's Cotton. It was a controversial picture. It was entered in the Davis Wildflower Competition and was kicked out because it was too controversial. And of course, in 1936, General Lee was installed in Lee Park in Dallas, and that became very controversial. Here's one you might not have noticed. This is Donald Vogel, and it's called Marionettes. And this passage is from Donald's memoir, in which he's talking about the group of artists that he found when he came to Dallas. They were a closed group. It was their ball game, and I was coming to bat. My problem, the umpires were all on their side. And he names them, Bywaters, Dozier, and Bearden. It was a good painting done in high spirits. However, it fell quite flat with its subjects. And Frank Freed, a Houston artist, a 1948 picture on community spirit. Do you know this picture by Robert Levers, who taught at the University of Texas, the LBJ Library Under Siege, 1984? It's a humorous picture. What does he have in mind? Is he thinking back to Thomas Cole's Course of Empire and the destruction that Cole predicted? Some people have associated, in fact, the destruction in this picture with the entrance of Texas into the Union. Cole seeing the Union under Andrew Jackson come to a high point Texas comes into the Union, and then he predicts destruction. I don't know if that's in Cole's mind or not, but some people have made that connection. So that just suggests, I guess, that there might be some controversial images in Texas art. And so with that, Dr. Olmos.
Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Ron and CASETA for inviting me here. I feel I shouldn't address the elephant in the room, though. I'm here, I think, for diversity. Right? You needed more people under 60 years old. I can say that knowing that I'll be on the other side soon enough. So, we are all subject to time. But seriously, this is an important topic. I don't have to tell you that. We live it every day. We see it in the news. We see it in our kids and the experiences they have. And we need to think about this. I'm a little bit out of my element here in many ways, but one of those is that also, like Victoria, I'm not an art historian. I won't be able to tell you much about the artists I'll be talking about. I'm a documentary historian, as it were. I think to Eleanor's point about the number of images about the Alamo, there are many more books about the Alamo than there are images of the Alamo, perhaps. I'm willing to bet. So I think this is the context in which we're working. I work on U.S.-Mexico borderlands history, particularly in the 19th century, or the long 19th century, and constructions of race and ethnicity in the Americas. My book, Beyond the Alamo, looks at San Antonio in, I guess from 1821 to 1861, which was the period of transition, as we know. Now, but I do want to start with one point that Eleanor made in her talk, and I hadn't planned to talk about this, but it seemed to really hit on my comment, and I think it's important to start there. She said we need to get Texas art out of Texas. And it was in the larger context of essentially defining the nation, national art, and where Texas places in that. I want to put it into a question. Is Texas ready for its art to be out of Texas? Is Texas ready for its history to be engaged on a national stage? I'm afraid it's not, and I'll explain why. Now, I teach Texas history as well at the University of Houston, and one of the things I always like to do is spend a class talking about the Alamo itself, and not the battle, but the building. And I always start with this question, first of all. Most of you have been there, right? I'm going to say this. What was the first impression you had when you went to the Alamo? Like, I heard it, everybody said it's very small, right? I could just stop right there. Right? Why is that your first impression? Where does that come from? And that comes from a personal history, a cultural history, popular language of the way the Alamo, what the Alamo means and what it occupies in our imagination. And that's not history, right? That's imagination. And that's the challenge we have as historians, to take what we work on and engage imagination. And I think that's where art is particularly powerful and occupies an important space in that particular discussion. When I look at the Alamo, I see multiple contexts. Now, I call this the postcard image because it's a postcard. It's a day much like today, a beautiful day, right? Well, what's missing? That's what context is. What's missing? People. So we don't know the size based on this image, but that's the image we get, right? Usually don't get an image of the Alamo with people next to it. We also don't get an image with buildings around it. And that's very much part of the conversation even today over what can be built around the Alamo to maintain that iconic image. What else is missing? The church, right? We have the nichos there. You see them very clearly. I ask my students, what are these little carved out spaces between the columns? And I'll get enough students to raise their hand and say, oh, that's where the statues go, right? So that's another context that's been removed. A final context, who built the Alamo? Who built the Alamo? What was the Alamo built, what was its original purpose? As a mission, right? You think the priests built that Alamo? They weren't going to lift a finger for that. Indigenous people built it, right? So here we have the quintessential image of Texas, defining Texas, really, built by indigenous people, during a Catholic period that was a Mexican structure. Yet time begins, historical time begins in 1836, right? That's when the history begins. And again, as a historian, what can I do? I can talk about everything that happened until I was blue in the face. But this is the challenge that we have. You know what else is missing? Time. Time is missing. Not only is it distorted in terms of that narrative, that timeline that I just described, but what if the image of the Alamo was this? What if this was the iconic image of the Alamo? When I present students this sort of image, they see time represented in this image. They see war. They see destruction. I think there's a dissonance that goes on when folks struggle to learn the contradiction that the Alamo was a defeat, because there's nothing defeatist about the way it's presented, right? It's presented as a triumph, through defeat, if you will. This has defeat written all over it. And in fact, the Alamo that we know is a reconstruction, a conscious reconstruction. What if we thought of the Alamo itself as a sculpture, rather than as a historical building? Right? That's the question I have. How do we take what's there as a conscious effort to present an image, not to recover anything? Because you know what happened? By the way, again, time doesn't stop. So what's happening with the Alamo now? The stucco's falling off. Right? What happened when the stucco fell off? The paintings of the inside of the church are starting to now are out. It was a colorful building on the inside. It was a church, right? It wasn't plain white stucco. You don't need a better metaphor for whitewashing the past than what happened inside the Alamo. But the recreation of the Alamo went beyond the image. It went into popular notions of history and into popular culture. Generations grew up with different depictions of the Alamo and of the Alamo story. And what's central here, and what's critical here, and maybe it's because I'm a historian, I care about stories ultimately, but stories are powerful, narratives are powerful, that's what we do. And embedded in those narratives are things like race and nationalism, right? They exist as stories. So what I'm going to be doing is talking about stories of race today, to talk about what makes something controversial. I was going to sing the Davy Crockett theme, but I would spare you. There's no better way to show you what I mean by the importance of stories, and that those stories change over time, than to look at a timeline of when different Confederate monuments and school namings took place in the United States, starting from just after the Civil War to close to the present. And what we see here is those commemorations are happening in two spikes at particular times, right? During the rise of Jim Crow and during the Civil Rights Movement. We cannot separate when art is being produced from its time period. But because of that time period, because time changes, because things change over time, if they didn't, I would be out of a job. Because things change over time, we are now in a different time. And we have to understand that what was done at a particular time that wasn't controversial can now be controversial. Right? I was even thinking, it made me even reflect on what makes something controversial. Because it wasn't controversial when it was created. I mean, there are times when folks are pretty clear about it, but ultimately it's a product of the culture, it's a product of the time. But now it's controversial. So what's changed? and I think it's pretty clear, one of the things that's changed is access to power. Your relationship to who has political power, who has economic power, who has social power in a particular place. So that's, as a historian, what I concentrate on when I'm looking at that context of creation. Now we've gone through, so we're in a period of rethinking now in terms of the Civil War, clearly. I grew up here in San Antonio, 2 miles from what was and is still Lee High School, right? But we know, if any of you know the story, Lee High School, and I used to drive, as a kid, I would drive by Lee High School, and there was the gym had a large Confederate flag, battle flag painted on the side of the gym. They were the Lee Rebels, I think. Volunteers, thank you. The Lee Volunteers. And I remember driving by and not even questioning it once. And through high school, didn't have a problem with it. And in some ways, it took leaving Texas to understand, wait a minute, that's messed up, right? And it took a while, but San Antonio also realized that's messed up. But it's a difficult conversation. It's harder to change something that's already been built, right? What was the splitting the baby, if you will, for Lee High School? Now it's called Legacy of Education Excellence High School, LEE. You can't, they saved a lot of money doing that, by the way. You didn't have to change the stationery that way. So now we're in a different time. We have new monuments, right? There's the new monument to lynching outside of Birmingham, Alabama, that was just inaugurated this week. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice. I can think of no better place to go to understand race in our time, in our history, in our country. I think it's going to redefine our country. I really do. So, what about Texas? Why does Texas get a pass when it comes to this history? Why isn't the Texas Revolution under the same microscope that the Civil War is and the Confederacy is experiencing? I don't have the answer. I have a few thoughts about that, and that's what I want to talk about. When I look at the Republic of Texas, and there's a great book by Andrew Torget on the role of cotton and slavery in the Revolution of Texas, the Texas Revolution. I struggle to reconcile the way we talk about the Texas Republic as, this moment where Texas was independent, and ignore things like Section 9 of the Texas Republic Constitution, which specifically says, no free person of African descent shall be permitted to reside permanently in the Republic. That's pretty unequivocal, right? This is defining the Republic of Texas as a slaveholder republic. It's in the Constitution. It's not a feeling about things. It's documented. It's the supreme law of the land at this time. It's, in some ways, a trial run of the Confederacy when you look at it. I look at the politics around Texas history in the State Board of Education. In its recent middle school Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills Standards, which lays out what all 7th graders need to know and will be tested on, you have things like explain how the establishment of the Republic of Texas brought civil, political, and religious freedom to Texas. Now, as a historian, I could just make two edits. I would put a question mark at the end, and I would say, instead of explain, I would ask, did the establishment of the Republic of Texas bring civil, political, and religious freedom? Because when you say all these people, like, to everybody in Texas or to just a few, that's the question. And it's, again, there's no denying this, right? This is, every historian knows this, but it's not part of the popular discourse. I walked out of the Wyndham Hotel. I think many of you are staying there. There's a plaque right on the river there. Beautiful renovation of the river. I love it. And there's a plaque talking about the former, I think it was a mill that was in that location. And it was a landmark prior to 1835, right? And it was also, the plaque goes on to note that when the Texian forces entered into San Antonio in November of 1835, they headquartered there. And then it goes on to say, in the liberation of San Antonio, right? And you could have used a lot of other words. The liberation of San Antonio, I think, is pretty specific, right? And liberation of San Antonio, again, goes along with a particular story. This is what I mean, stories are important. It's one narrative of San Antonio. Did some people feel liberated in San Antonio? Certainly. Were there were Tejanos who were liberated, that felt more liberated, there were Tejanos that felt less liberated. Certainly, 20 years later, they might argue with that question after experiencing life in the new San Antonio. So, again, perspective, time, context matter. So, I want to take a quick aside here. When I say when I'm talking about what I mean when I say race itself exists within narratives as well, the stories we tell of race. And in particular, I want to ask this question, and maybe it gives us some insight into why the Texas Revolution gets a pass in this case. For instance, where do Mexican people fall in American racial history? Obviously, it's not clear. Are they immigrants? Are they outsiders? Are they enemies? Are they part of that history? They're all of those, right? And in some ways, when you look at Latin American history and you look at Mexico specifically, we see a history that's much more that engages multiple definitions of race. These come from a series of Casta paintings that were painted in the 18th and 18th and 19th century. There's a great, by the way, if any of you all get to Monterrey anytime soon, there's the Sada collection is up now at the Museum of Mexican History down in the Macro Plaza. They have, I'm not exaggerating, at least 6 or 7 complete sets of these Casta paintings. Originals, oh, they're gorgeous. You need to go and see these. They're a real jewel. These are actually the photos I took of them, which give us a particular link between the way race was drawn and how it was connected to social status. When we look at this particular one by Jose Joaquin Magan in 1770, there's text on the top left corner which goes beyond, most of them just describe the mixture. They always have a mother, a father, and a child, right? The mother, it might be India, the father might be Español, and the child is then mestizo. And then it goes on to, there are up to 64 of these different categories, depending, if the mestizo child becomes the mother, a mestizo mother and a Indio father would create another mixture. And by the way, in all of these Casta paintings, you also have an African influence as well. So you have, it's not just Indian, Spanish alone, it's Indian, Spanish, and Black, and all 3 of those mixtures over several generations. You can see why after a while they just stopped. It became sort of maddening. This one, I had a translation, that Cambujo is the mixture, and it's usually heavy set and lazy and of low intelligence. So that's what I mean by a narrative that accompanies race. It's not, and a social status that accompanies race. And I mention that because the story and the images rely on each other. They support each other. They build a bigger picture that we inhabit, that we live. Let me go back to Ron's image of the dawn at the Alamo. Now, There are a few questions that were raised before our panel that a few of you sent forward. One of those was, is early Texas art relatively protected from controversy? I think you probably get the idea. We're proposing something here, that a particular answer here, and we're curious to see what you have to say. I don't think it's much of a question whether this painting is seen as controversial. I mean, this is painted by McCardle. McCardle also painting Jeff Davis in 1890, Lee in 1885. They're folks that are painting these historic events and painting them in the way that's depicting history as though this is the way it happened. And again, before films, which are even more powerful in creating this sort of virtual reality. This is the virtual reality folks have at hand. And they're basing it on stories. They're basing it on the stories that are being told at this particular time. But they're also basing it on a language of savagery, a language of attack, a language of superiority, racial superiority. One of the works I rely on is Jim Crisp's work on, he has a book on sleuthing the Alamo, where he spends time looking at Onderdonk and others. And I think he makes a very clear point there that they are influenced by works on Custer's Last Stand and other works that depict the same sort of barbarians at the gate that Last Stand implies here. One of the ones that I really wanted to spend more time on is, I can never say his name right, Gentfield, 1896, death of Dickinson, where the implication there is that they were both killed, right? Now, however heroically the Mexican soldiers are depicted here, there's a very emotional end product of this, right? The Mexicans are baby killers. Now, there are other narratives that exist at the same time. There's a narrative of modernity versus sort of picaresque tradition, right? You have hardworking frontiersmen, Austin, in contrast to the fandangos, right? That are maybe less hardworking, right? That imply a kind of mañana Mexican culture, right? By the way, who built San Antonio? It's like the who built the Alamo question. Mexican people did. All right. So let me end here then by talking about how these images reinforce particular stories, and how we have to see how those stories reinforce racial structures and racial order in Texas. They create a history of Texas that begins at the Alamo and makes it near impossible to talk about the history before that. Fortunately, this conference will have a panel tomorrow on earlier history, and we are celebrating the 300th anniversary of San Antonio, after all. I was just at the conference last month. So this is a time to ask the question, this is the controversial part in my mind that we need to engage. How are these images preventing a discussion of various stories, of more stories, of different ways of telling the narrative of Texas past that expands it rather than narrows it? Of course, one of the first films that comes out about Texas was Martyrs of the Alamo, made by D.W. Griffith's Film Company just after Birth of a Nation. And if you watch this film next to Birth of a Nation, you don't need to go much further to say that there is a direct parallel that even though the U.S. has a language around black-white race, Mexicans are being put in that black category at that point. Sure enough, the Jim Crow that Mexicans live under in Texas from that period until the Civil Rights Movement and the continued segregation that exists today might not be called racism, but certainly it looks that way. And finally, there's still a continuation of this hero making, and in some ways the debate is still going on. I should have included, if any of you all have a chance while you're in town to go to the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. There's a great exhibit up right now called The Other Side of the Alamo, Art Against Myth, that has about 20 Chicano artists that are taking the myth of the Alamo and the symbol of the Alamo and really reinterpreting it in fantastic ways. But this is contemporary modern art, right? But they are engaging that story and that story, and in a sense, engaging how that story lives on today. But it also lives on this way. I live in Houston, and so drive down on the way to the San Jacinto Monument, and there are these murals that were painted onto the side of oil tanks because it's really hard to find the San Jacinto Monument through all the stacks. I don't know if any of you have been out there lately, but these images are, when I first saw them, I said, wow, they look like they're a film, and it turns out they actually are photographs that were sprayed onto a canvas and put on the tanks. But again, it's that historical recreation of different moments in Texas history that are reinscribed into this industrial landscape, but not necessarily challenging that story. So the question is, how do we take Texas into this national stage and ask those kinds of critical questions we ask about the Confederacy? I don't think we'll get the same answers, but certainly we need to ask the questions and not retreat behind, well, things are different in Texas. They're not. Right? What makes Texas different is not that it's Texas. It's not what it is, it's where it is. And it happens to be at the intersection of three major empires: the Spanish-Mexican Empire, the British-American Empire, and the Indigenous Empire. Right? And that's where Texas exists, and that's what makes the Texas story relevant then and incredibly relevant today.
Thank you, Dr. Ramos. Your story about the Alamo reminds me of a story that I often told my classes. Back in the 1960s, there were a group of English miners who had gone on strike, and the leader of the union was making a presentation on the news. And he said, "We will not quit, we will not stop, this will be our Alamo."
I think every politician said the same thing. Dr. Harvey?
The perspective that I want to bring to this today, and I think the reason I got asked to contribute to this is, in Washington, D.C., we're sitting at ground zero on a lot of different things these days. Not the least of which is the whole controversy over what we do with monuments that now appear no longer to be as desirable in their current positions, and the controversy over whose monuments are they and what do they accomplish. And the interesting thing to me, you're going to have to sort of grant me a little bit of whimsy here with Marcus Aurelius here behind me, because he is relevant to what I have, not him specifically, but the guy on horseback. Because one of the things that we've just heard today is, in looking at Texas art, context changes your perspective, that what you accept as an image changes when you get to know what's behind it. It's the same way that happens when we befriend each other. We know a name, we put a face to a name, we get into a conversation, and we begin to deepen all of that. Defiance through defeat is an absolutely fantastic soundbite. Thank you very much for that. It may describe the Alamo, but essentially it gets us to the nub of the whole issue of every single Confederate monument that populates the United States of America. Because a funny thing happened in the wake of the Civil War. Usually it's the victor who gets to write the history, and in a weird way, the Civil War is damn near unique in world history, in that because the goal was to reunite the country and bring everyone back together again, Grant sent the Confederate soldiers back. It's plowing season, you need your horses. It's hunting season, you need your guns. Go home, be nice, don't do this again, and we'll call it a day. Which made family reunions a little fraught for how many generations has it been now? But the point is, we didn't annihilate the losers and we didn't deport them. We embraced them and we let them tell their stories. with the rise of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, to which I will admit I qualify on both sides of my family, as well as the Daughters of the American Revolution, so there you go. That body made sure that that defiance through defeat was going to become an indelible part of the American fabric. And it's interesting because my sculpture curator looks at these things and goes, up until about 5 years ago, every major monumental sculpture was darn near invisible in plain sight. I cannot tell you how many times I drive down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., and I am newly appreciative of how many sculptures there are, and I have no idea who these people are. And so that context is, in fact, changing. When you see Marcus Aurelius on his horse, we know there used to be a bridle, but essentially it's hands-free. How many of you ride? This is an important question. Really, nobody in this room rides horses? You guys are not going to get what this argument is going. I can just tell you that right now. The idea of the man on horseback who is controlling his horse through osmosis. There is no contact on the reins. There is this sense that they are operating in perfect synchrony without having to actually say anything to each other, without any messing with the horse's mouth, without any kind of badass behavior on the part of a horse who's kicking up because he doesn't really like the way he's being treated. Thank you very much. There is this sense that what conveys, this is George Washington, in case you hadn't figured that out. But the point is, he could be anyone, and what you are conditioned to understand is this is a man in perfect balance and perfect control who exudes the qualities of leadership that we admire. And then you go, and maybe if you're good, you actually read the template that tells you who it is. What I have discovered, sadly enough, is nobody reads my labels, so I'm kind of chapped about the whole idea that labels are going to solve the problem on anything. But on the one hand, I am profoundly moved by the fact that monumental equestrian sculptures have the power to make people fight with each other over where they should be and what they stand for. Awesome. It's like, I am all about the fact that art has the power to change the world. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be sitting here. That said, we have a responsibility to learn our history. And if there is anything that we need out of all of this, whether it's from a Texian perspective, a national perspective, or a global perspective, boy, we need to teach our history better. We need to teach it as more complicated than we've been given. We need to understand that monuments have the ability to shape and form opinions separate from the hero worship that comes through in all of this. And of course, that, as Ramon pointed out, these are not period pieces. These are mostly 20th century propaganda. Even most of the sculptures of George Washington long post-dated him as a way of looking back and venerating. So what happens when you get, for instance, my friend George up at the top, sitting on his horse, and my friend Bobby Lee, to whom I probably have a distant collateral relationship if you go back far enough. What happens when we look at the different ways that these men engage on horseback, and more importantly, the way the sculptors engage them on horseback? This is where I kind of asked how many, you're Texans. What do you mean you're not all equestrians? Come on. God, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with all of you people, but I do ride. And one of the things I have learned over the years is you can tell a lot about a man by the way he sits a horse. And I have to believe there's a little bit of editorializing that's been going on right under our noses by a generation of sculptors who did understand body language on a horse, even if we don't. And that George Washington is basically going, I got this completely under control. And Bobby Lee is not going to give that horse an opportunity to mess with him. Now that's Traveler. That's his best buddy up there. We've all seen the postcard. We know that, this is a relationship between man and horse that really means something, and yet he is cranking on that horse's bit in a way that I can tell you what happens next. The horse basically has had enough of it and starts getting in the way. So what does that say about leadership? What does it say about Lee's need for iron-fisted control over what's going on? Now, lest you think that I am picking on you folks, the sculpture at the top by Merwin Schrady is of General Ulysses S. Grant that is part of the Grant Monument at the base of the U.S. Capitol. Grant and his horse, it's probably Cincinnati. It's not, he had 2 horses that he really loved during the Civil War, but I'm assuming this one's Cincinnati. And by the way, we know the names of all the horses. They're not on the monuments. I'd like to fix that, but we do know who they are. So General Grant is up here at the top looking for all the world like he is looking one way, the horse is looking the other way. I have been on a horse where I have sat like that and the horse has kind of gone, she's not paying attention, is she? And I have landed flat on my butt on the ground. Grant is not going to brook any of that nonsense, and his horse has no intention of showing him up. What you see below is Merwin Schrady, same sculptor. That is the Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, Virginia, where the horse is behind the bit. He's got his head so far cranked down that his ability to use his forward carriage is completely impeded. I ride dressage. If I rode a horse like that, I would be off the horse and gotten a chewing out from my riding instructor. I wonder, and I'm not being completely self-deprecatingly humorous about it, I do wonder whether Merwin Schrady knew exactly what he was doing, and whether in doing a major Confederate monument on the heels of a major Union monument, whether or not there is an editorial judgment being folded into the horse as much as the rider. Now, actually, because of this panel, I've started to do some research on Confederate equestrian monuments and Union equestrian monuments to try to decide whether this is just Merwin Schrady or whether there is a code here. Those of you, you may understand there's kind of an apocryphal code that if a general, if he's on horseback and the horse has all 4 feet on the ground, he lived and died a natural death, 1 foot off the ground, wounded in battle, 2 legs off the ground, dies in battle. Well, that doesn't work with our friend Lee here anyway, and Lafayette waving his hat in Lafayette Park certainly lived a long time in France, so it doesn't actually hold that there is a code about horses' legs, but there probably is a code among horsemen about how you are depicted on horseback. So why does any of this matter to you, other than the fact that I can go on at great length about horses, is that we all understand that a person on horseback conveys a disproportionate amount of respect. Start with riot gear and police during demonstrations. Everyone moves out of the way for the horse. They may not move for the car, they may not move for the tank, but they move for the horse. I find that deeply satisfying. But when we talk about moving monuments, that's where the ground zero part of my job comes in. I cannot tell you how many of my well-intentioned colleagues have helpfully and not helpfully suggested that every single one of them be given to the Smithsonian. Which will solve nothing. Which brings me to the 2 points about why that is not the solution. First of all, scale. None of these monuments is intended to live indoors. None of the museums on this country have the land that allows you to portray them to great effect. Second, because of that scale and because what we are dealing with is an issue over what those monuments mean, moving them from a public setting to a museum setting does nothing to change the context. So I don't believe there is a one-size-fits-all answer to what happens when a community decides that a sculpture of a Confederate officer is no longer appropriate for their community. I do have a couple of helpful suggestions to pass the buck to other people, but I think they make sense. And one of them is, particularly across the South, considering that a more appropriate context is either on a battlefield or in a cemetery. We are not talking about erasing history. I am not talking about whether or not monuments should be moved, destroyed, or whatever. What I am talking about is that this is an opportunity for us to understand that what was hiding in plain sight is no longer hiding, and that when most of these monuments were erected, It was done so on public property. They are now maintained with public funds, and they send an undeniable, unfortunate, and unremovable signal to segments of our society that they are less than and that their history does not matter. And I think just as if we befriend each other and we discover that something that we have said or done is hurtful, if we care about the person, we find a way to make adjustments. I think the logical adjustment for each community is to consider what is the best appropriate setting for a monument that really should not be in the public sector, whether or not there are individuals who wish to adopt them. There's a chance that Chancellorsville Battlefield will get the Laura Gilpin Fraser sculpture of Lee and Jackson that came down in Baltimore. It's sitting in a warehouse. There are discussions going on about where is the appropriate place for this. There's a discussion about the Robert E. Lee Monument in Charlottesville, Virginia, just as I am sure there is a discussion about the one that was in Lee Park here. There are the Memphis sculptures that came down when the city council decided to decommission the parks and move things around. I think that what we are dealing with right now is an understanding that the broader segment of society has been operating under the benign assumption that these were doing no harm to anyone. And what we are now dealing with is the fact that we were wrong. And what we now have to do is figure out, without erasing history, without denying history, but instead by embracing history, the good and the bad, the awkward and the off-putting, understanding that every single one of us and every single one of them has feet of clay, that for every wonderful, heroic, gallant, thoughtful thing people do, there is something else you want to smack them for. That's what it means to be a human being. We're not looking to develop sculptures about demigods. We are looking to develop sculptures that help teach history, but that teach us about the need for perspective. For me, moving them off of public grounds should give us all time to think, to breathe, to talk, and to listen. None of this has to happen overnight. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. But I do think that as a matter of just common sense, human respect for other people, it's time to stop paying your tax dollars to take care of these and to think hard about letting them go into the private sector somewhere where they can be interpreted or understood differently. It's the least we owe to ourselves and each other to say that I believe that as human beings, we own our history, we own our flaws, and we owe it to ourselves to evolve.
Thank you, Dr. Harvey. I know that we're running over. How are we doing on time? Do we need to move on to the next panel?
How about one question?
One question? Submitted in writing.
Everyone gets to vote.
Okay, one question. Anybody on the panel? I know you were furiously taking notes.
I mean, I'd just like to make a final comment, which is there's no such thing as life without controversy. There's no such thing as history without controversy. There's no reason for any one person, any one community, any one constituency to feel more or less embarrassed than the next one. We've all got skeletons in our closet, and the very best thing we can do is own it and move on. I grew up with Confederates in my attic to my basement. When I worked on my exhibition on the Civil War, people said, you know, how do you square all of this? And I'm kind of like, I view history as a way of understanding what kind of country I want to live in. Not what I am chained to by my ancestry, but what I hope for my future. And I think it's up to all of us to look at what we will and won't stand for and what we will and won't stand up for, and understand what kind of country you want to have and how you're going to help make that happen. art plays a big role in that.
Thank you very much.